A storm can never topple a tree with deep roots. It only sweeps away the withered leaves that were already meant to fall. The winter afternoon sky over Pulaski County hung suffocatingly gray. Snow fell in thick, unrelenting sheets across Kentucky, burying everything beneath freezing white. The wind howled through barren pines, carrying a biting chill that dropped the temperature to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Standing motionless before the wrought iron gates of Thorn & Son Lumber was Elias Thorn. He was a man of 71 years, though the deep crevices on his weathered face and the calloused texture of his hands told the story of a lifetime etched by unyielding labor. He wore a faded canvas jacket, offering little protection, yet his posture remained entirely unbowed. Directly across from him stood Sterling Vance. Sterling was 38 years old, dressed in a tailored charcoal overcoat that starkly contrasted with the sawdust-covered ground. His face was a mask of calculated indifference, devoid of any warmth or human empathy. In his gloved hand, he extended a crisp white envelope containing the final eviction mandate. There was no hesitation, only the cold precision of a predator closing a trap. Elias did not look at the paper right away. Instead, his pale blue eyes locked onto Sterling, peering past the expensive coat and the arrogant tilt of his chin. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of 35 long years. 35 years ago, Elias had carried a terrified 3-year-old boy on his shoulders after his younger brother perished in a logging accident. Elias had sacrificed his own youth to raise his nephew. He had taught Sterling to distinguish between oak and mahogany by scent alone, how to negotiate with contractors, and how to build this massive timber empire from the ground up. Now it smelled only of betrayal. The trap had been laid masterfully during the previous winter. Elias had fallen bedridden with severe pneumonia, hovering on the edge of consciousness. Trusting the boy he had raised, Elias blindly signed documents Sterling presented under the guise of temporary operational permits. But those papers were a meticulously crafted labyrinth of corporate restructuring and hidden equity clauses. They were woven with legal poison, designed to slowly bleed Elias of his ownership. By the time the old man regained his strength, the bank accounts had been drained, and the deed to the land he had bled for was irrevocably transferred to Sterling Vance. "It is time for you to leave, Elias," Sterling said smoothly, his voice devoid of a single tremor. "The company requires a modern direction. Your presence here is no longer a legal reality." Elias stood perfectly still. An ordinary man might have fallen to his knees in the slush. An ordinary man might have screamed to the heavens, cursing the cruel injustice, or begged for a shred of mercy. Elias did none of these things. He adhered to the silent, stoic resilience of a forgotten era. He understood that words were utterly useless against a heart turned to stone. He slowly reached out with a battered hand, his thick fingers gripping the edge of the envelope. He did not snatch it. He took it with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that made Sterling instinctively take a half-step backward. Elias looked around the massive lumberyard one final time. He saw the towering stacks of cured cedar, the heavy machinery, the steel warehouse he had bolted together, and the fading footprints where he had walked every dawn for over 3 decades. He turned away. There were no dramatic farewells. Elias simply adjusted the strap of the single canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder. It contained 3 sets of worn work clothes, an old leather Bible, and a set of antique carving chisels. Everything else, every photograph, every comfortable armchair, every memory tied to the grand house, he left behind. The snow was falling heavier now, quickly covering the tracks of his leather boots as he walked down the desolate road. The bitter wind whipped against his face, stinging his cheeks, but he kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. He calculated the distance to the nearest town limits, knowing it was at least a 4-mile trek through the blizzard. His knees, aching from years of bearing massive timber logs, protested with every agonizing step, yet his mind remained remarkably clear. He had been stripped of his empire, his home, and his family in one fell swoop. The world had told him he was finished, but Elias knew the truth. A man is only truly defeated when he surrenders his dignity. Cars occasionally sped past him on the slick asphalt, their tires throwing freezing mud on the shoulder of the road. None stopped. To the passing world, he was just another old man walking aimlessly in a winter storm. But beneath the worn fabric of his coat, a quiet fire still burned. He felt the weight of his empty pockets. He knew exactly what little remained to his name. He knew the approaching night would be the coldest he had ever faced, a true test of the Stoic philosophy governing his long life. Elias walked steadily into the blinding white winter storm, completely unaware that the bone-chilling cold of this Kentucky winter was only the beginning of a bizarre, unimaginable arrangement by fate.
Night fell over the county with the crushing weight of black ice. The temperature plummeted well below freezing, turning the damp Kentucky air into a field of invisible floating needles. Elias sought refuge in the only shelter left to him, his 1998 Ford F-Series truck. The vehicle was a battered relic of rusted quarter panels, a cracked windshield, a failing alternator, and a heater that only blew cold, metallic-smelling air. He parked beneath the flickering amber streetlight on the edge of town. Wrapping a thin wool blanket around his broad shoulders, he lay across the ripped vinyl bench seat. His 71-year-old joints throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony. The cold seeped through the steel doors, biting at his ankles and gnawing at his spine. He did not complain. Instead, Elias reached into his heavy canvas coat pocket and pulled out his entire life savings. He smoothed the crumpled paper money against the dashboard, flattening the dog-eared corners with his heavy thumb, and stacked the silver coins in a neat, precise tower. 10, 20, 30, he counted slowly. $34.50. That was the exact sum total of 35 years of backbreaking labor. A lesser man would have wept at the sight of the meager pile, cursing the heavens for the profound injustice of it all. Elias simply folded the bills, slipped them back into his pocket, and closed his eyes to wait for the dawn. Morning broke with a pale, anemic light. The Pulaski County Courthouse buzzed with the frantic energy of predatory opportunism. It was the annual tax lien auction. The grand hall smelled of wet wool coats, cheap cologne, stale coffee, and raw greed. Rows of wooden benches were packed with real estate flippers, local investors, and landlords looking to capitalize on the misfortunes of others. Elias sat in the very last row. He remained perfectly still, a silent mountain of a man amid a sea of whispering vultures. The auctioneer, a stout man with a booming voice and a sweating forehead, rattled off properties at a blistering pace. Suburban homes with overgrown lawns, abandoned commercial lots, and foreclosed farmland went to the highest bidders for tens of thousands of dollars. Elias watched the frenzy with mild, detached interest. He was waiting for the dregs. He was waiting for the forgotten corners of the earth that no one else wanted. "Next up is Lot 42, the auctioneer called out, wiping his brow with a cotton handkerchief. A water rights parcel and an abandoned boathouse situated on the eastern cove of Lake Cumberland. The structure is heavily compromised. Wood rot, sunken pylons, no utilities, and it sits on a stagnant mudflat. The county considers it a total teardown. Opening bid is set to cover the bare minimum in back taxes. The auctioneer scanned the room. Do I hear $10? Silence hung in the warm air. Several men in the front row chuckled, shaking their heads. Someone muttered a joke about buying firewood. Nobody wanted the burden of clearing a rotting pile of infested timber from a freezing lake. It was worse than worthless. It was a liability. Elias raised his calloused hand. $9, Elias said calmly. His voice was not loud, but the deep, gravelly baritone cut through the murmuring crowd like a steel blade. Heads turned, eyes darted toward the back of the room, taking in the sight of the old man in the frayed canvas jacket and muddy leather boots. The room erupted into a chorus of mocking sneers. Men leaned into each other, laughing openly at the crazy old beggar wasting his last dimes on a pile of wet garbage. Elias did not flinch. $9 going once, the auctioneer said, looking almost apologetic. Going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back for $9. Elias stood up and walked down the center aisle. He felt the heavy, judging stares of the wealthy investors pressing against him, yet he moved with the steady, measured grace of a king walking through his own court. He reached the clerk's desk and reached into his heavy coat. He laid the bills down. He stacked the quarters. He pushed exactly $9 across the polished mahogany counter to pay for the deed, and then counted out the remaining coins to cover the meager processing fee. The young clerk looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion, handing over a yellowed, typewritten document bearing the county seal. Elias took the paper. He turned and walked out of the double doors, stepping back into the freezing winter wind without looking back at the laughing crowd. Holding the crumpled deed in his weathered hands, the 71-year-old man had no idea he had just purchased the very thing that soon the entire town would desperately covet.
The rusted engine of the 1998 Ford truck choked and sputtered as Elias navigated the winding, treacherous dirt road. He drove exactly 3 miles off the main county highway, following a forgotten trail heavily overgrown with dead briars and leafless oak branches. The tires slipped in the half-frozen mud, sliding towards the steep embankments, but his massive hands held the steering wheel steady. He finally reached the property line of Lot 42. He killed the engine. The silence of the eastern cove was absolute, broken only by the mournful wind sweeping across Lake Cumberland. Elias stepped out of the truck, the bitter cold instantly biting through his thin canvas coat. He stood on the edge of the embankment and looked down at his new domain. To the untrained eye, the scene was an absolute nightmare of neglected decay. The boathouse sat 50 feet out into the murky water, surrounded by a thick, stagnant mudflat that smelled strongly of rotting fish, decaying pine needles, and centuries of wet earth. The structure itself leaned severely to the left, groaning under the weight of a collapsed corrugated tin roof that was painted bright orange with heavy rust. The exterior siding boards were warped, splintered, and covered in thick layers of black moss. Half of the front dock had already surrendered to the lake, its jagged wooden fingers reaching helplessly out of the icy water. It looked completely dead. Any ordinary man would have looked at this colossal mess, hung his head in despair, and walked away. A younger, impatient man like Sterling Vance would have seen only a worthless pile of debris fit for nothing but a controlled fire. But Elias was not an ordinary man. He was a master carpenter. The omniscient eye of a builder does not look at the peeling paint or the broken glass. It looks directly at the skeleton. Elias walked slowly down the steep, slippery bank, his heavy leather boots sinking deep into the freezing mud. The icy sludge crept up past his ankles, soaking his worn denim jeans, but he paid no attention to the freezing agony. He waded directly toward the primary load-bearing pillars holding the entire ruined structure above the water. The water here was 2 feet deep and filled with sharp rocks and tangled weeds. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, beautifully maintained steel carving chisel. He placed his bare, calloused hand against the thickest wooden pillar. It felt slimy, covered in a 2-inch layer of aquatic growth and soft, spongy rot. He began to scrape. With slow, deliberate strokes, Elias peeled away the decades of dark green algae, black mold, and waterlogged decay. He chipped past the soft exterior, pressing the sharp steel edge deeper into the heart of the timber. Suddenly, the chisel stopped, bouncing off the core with a sharp, ringing vibration. Elias wiped the remaining mud away with his thumb. Beneath the ugly, decaying exterior lay a solid, pristine core of deep amber wood. It was old-growth American chestnut. Elias recognized the tight, magnificent grain immediately. It was a legendary species of timber that had been virtually wiped out by blight nearly a century ago. This wood was incredibly dense, fiercely heavy, and naturally impervious to water, insects, and time itself. The foundation was an absolute fortress. Elias moved from pillar to pillar, wading through the freezing mud, testing the structural joints, the crossbeams, and the submerged anchoring points. Every single load-bearing timber was made of the same indestructible chestnut. The original builders had driven these massive logs deep into the solid limestone bedrock beneath the lake. The tin roof was absolute garbage, and the wall sidings were completely unsalvageable, but the foundational skeleton of the boathouse was flawless. It was unyielding. A quiet, profound sense of connection washed over the old man. Standing waist-deep in the freezing water of the Kentucky winter, Elias looked up at the leaning, battered structure. It was a mirror of his own soul. The world had stripped away his wealth, his business, and his family, leaving him looking broken and discarded to the naked eye. But beneath the ragged clothes and the weary flesh, his foundation remained firmly anchored in the bedrock of his dignity. The storms of life could tear away the roof, but they could never snap his spine. He pulled himself up out of the freezing mud and climbed onto the remains of the front deck. The wind whipped violently off the open water, freezing the wet mud on his jeans into solid sheets of ice. Elias ignored the shivering of his own muscles. He began to systematically pace the length of the dock, his eyes scanning the geometry of the warped floorboards, mentally calculating the thousands of feet of fresh lumber and the hundreds of pounds of galvanized nails he would need to salvage the deck. He moved with slow, heavy steps, carefully testing the weight distribution on the algae-slick planks. The wood groaned under his considerable bulk, but it held. He took another step. Walking along the sagging dock floorboards, Elias stepped on a wide, discolored wooden plank that echoed under his boot with a strangely hollow sound.
The true measure of a man is not found in the comfortable halls of his success, but in the freezing, solitary mud of his lowest valley. For Elias Thorne, the valley was a rotting boathouse on Lake Cumberland in the dead of winter. The temperature rarely rose above 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was a punishing, invisible force, biting at any exposed skin and turning the dampness of the lake into a suffocating, icy shroud. He had no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no power tools. He had only his scarred hands, a few basic hand tools he had carried in his canvas duffel bag, and an unbreakable will. The labor began at the crack of dawn. The corrugated tin roof was his first enemy. The rusted panels were jagged, heavy, and firmly fused together by decades of severe neglect and heavy oxidation. Elias climbed a makeshift ladder he had carefully fashioned from salvaged 2x4 wooden studs, his 71-year-old joints grinding painfully with every upward step. He used an old, heavy framing hammer to pry the rusted iron nails from the petrified wood. Every single pull was a brutal battle of physics and endurance. The high-pitched screech of bending metal echoed across the empty, frozen expanse of the lake. It was agonizing work. He tore the heavy tin panels off one by one, tossing them down into the mud, where they landed with a hollow, defeating crash. His thick canvas jacket offered very little warmth against the brutal wind blowing off the miles of open water. His hands, though protected by incredibly thick calluses, cracked and bled in the dry, freezing air. He simply wiped the blood on his faded denim jeans, adjusted his stance, and continued pulling, prying, and lifting. He did not stop. He did not curse the biting cold. He did not cry out when a rusted, jagged edge sliced a 3-inch gash directly across his left forearm. He merely bound the bleeding wound tightly with a strip of torn cloth torn from his spare shirt, pulled his heavy sleeve down over it, and picked up his hammer once again. The pain was a harsh physical reality, but it was absolutely not a master he answered to. When the sun finally dipped below the distant pine tree line, plunging the eastern cove into a freezing, pitch-black darkness, Elias would carefully descend to the ground. His spine throbbed with a dull, rhythmic, and inescapable agony. His broad shoulders felt as though they were completely filled with crushed glass. He gathered fallen pine branches, dry leaves, and washed-up driftwood, patiently building a small, crackling fire on a cleared patch of gravel near the shoreline. He slept in the cab of his 1998 Ford truck. The ripped vinyl seats were freezing, and the thin wool blanket provided barely enough heat to keep him from succumbing to the deadly winter temperatures. He ate cold canned beans straight from the tin and drank freezing water from a 1-gallon plastic jug. While Sterling Vance sat in a plush leather armchair in a heated, luxurious mansion, sipping expensive aged bourbon and counting stolen money, Elias rubbed warmth into his trembling, arthritic hands over a smoking driftwood fire. The contrast was absolute. Yet Elias slept soundly. His conscience was entirely clean, his soul unburdened by the heavy, suffocating chains of deceit. He woke up the next morning at 4 o'clock, his body stiff and screaming for rest, and walked right back down into the icy, unwelcoming water. The submerged foundation came next. Elias waded into the thigh-deep freezing mud to reinforce the old-growth chestnut pylons. He hauled 50-pound bags of concrete mix from the bed of his truck, balancing them on his shoulder, walking the 50 yards down the steep dirt embankment over and over again. He mixed the heavy cement entirely by hand in an old plastic tub, using a broken shovel to churn the thick, gray sludge. The water drawn from the lake was so incredibly cold it numbed his fingers straight to the bone, turning his weathered skin a pale, ghostly blue. He packed the wet, heavy concrete tightly around the base of the submerged pillars, building a solid collar of stone to protect the ancient wood from the shifting, relentless tides of the lake. He worked with the steady, rhythmic pace of a machine. Hours blurred into days. Days slowly bled into long, freezing weeks. The immense pile of rotting, discarded debris on the shore grew progressively larger, while the silhouette of the old boathouse grew leaner, cleaner, and immensely stronger. Elias was not entirely unseen. About 2 miles down the winding shoreline lived Tobias Finch. Tobias was 68 years old, a retired diesel mechanic and a lifelong fisherman whose face was weathered into deep, permanent creases by the sun and the harsh wind. He was a man of very few words, preferring the silent, predictable company of his aluminum flat-bottom boat to the chaotic, untrustworthy noise of modern society. For 3 uninterrupted days, Tobias had closely watched the old man working at the lawn allotment 42.
Through a pair of battered, heavy brass binoculars, Tobias saw Elias hauling sheets of rusted tin, mixing concrete in the freezing mud, and sleeping in a dilapidated, rusted truck. He saw the grim determination, the undeniable professional skill in the way Elias perfectly leveled a wooden joist, and the brutal physical toll it was clearly taking on the old man's body. He recognized a kindred spirit, a man who deeply understood the sacred, healing power of solitary, backbreaking labor. He did not offer pity. Pity was an insult to a proud man like Elias. Instead, on the early morning of the fourth day, as the temperature hovered dangerously near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the low, steady hum of an outboard motor broke the absolute silence of the cove. Elias paused his hammering and looked out over the gray water. The small aluminum boat cut cleanly through the thick morning mist, gliding smoothly towards the ruined dock. Tobias cut the sputtering engine and let the boat drift until its metal bow bumped gently against the submerged chestnut pylons. He did not say a single word of greeting. He did not ask if Elias was cold, hungry, tired, or homeless. He reached into the bottom of his boat. He hauled out a 5-gallon plastic jug of heavy kerosene and heaved it onto the remaining solid planks of the wooden deck. Next came a heavy canvas sack that smelled richly of dark roasted coffee beans, a cast-iron percolator, and a tightly bound bundle of dry, split hickory firewood. Finally, he reached down and pulled out a heavy forged steel crowbar with a thick, textured rubber grip. It was a very serious tool, measuring exactly 36 inches long and weighing a solid 12 pounds. He tossed it onto the wooden deck with a loud metallic clatter. "The mud out here gets packed tighter than a bank vault," Tobias said, his voice rough and gravelly. "A standard hammer will never break it. You need real leverage." "I appreciate it," Elias replied simply. "I have way too much coffee taking up valuable space," Tobias muttered coldly, completely refusing to accept any form of gratitude. "And that steel crowbar is heavy. Keep it completely out of my boat." With a single powerful thrust of his wooden oar, Tobias pushed his aluminum boat away from the dock. He pulled the starter cord, the outboard motor roared violently to life, and he drove away, disappearing back into the thick morning fog. There were no emotional speeches, no invasive questions, and absolutely no tearful thanks. It was the pure, unspoken brotherhood of men who knew exactly what it meant to survive in a harsh world. The kerosene heater completely changed the nights. The cramped cab of the Ford truck finally became a sanctuary of genuine warmth, allowing Elias's battered, aching muscles to finally relax and recover. The strong, incredibly bitter black coffee fueled his freezing mornings, sending a powerful jolt of fire through his veins before he stepped back out into the freezing water.
But it was the steel crowbar that truly changed the work. Armed with the heavy steel lever, Elias aggressively attacked the sunken, ruined sections of the front dock with renewed vigor. The thick rubber grip effectively absorbed the shocking, painful impacts as he jammed the wedged steel tip into the frozen mud, prying up waterlogged oak planks, rusted iron cleats, and massive tangled knots of submerged tree roots. The physical labor became a quiet meditation. With every single swing of the heavy crowbar, Elias mentally hammered away the lingering, painful shadows of Sterling's betrayal. With every heavy pound of mud he cleared, he dug deeper into his own immense reservoir of internal strength. He was completely filthy, covered from head to toe in freezing black mud, wet sawdust, and dried blood. Yet he possessed a profound, unshakable dignity. He was not a weak victim crying out in the wilderness. He was a master architect, rebuilding his entire world from the absolute bottom. By the third week of January, the absolute worst of the demolition phase was complete. The long shoreline was totally clear of trash.
The dangerous, jagged tin was piled safely away, and the massive chestnut pillars stood proud and remarkably clean in the icy water. Only one massive obstacle remained. It was a colossal, petrified tree stump, measuring nearly 4 feet in diameter, buried deep in the thick mud directly beneath the exact center of the old dock. It had likely been there for 5 decades, acting as an immovable anchor for sinking debris and rotting aquatic weeds. It was directly in the way of the new wooden joists Elias desperately needed to lay down. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bleeding streaks of dark orange and bruised purple across the freezing surface of Lake Cumberland. The ambient temperature was dropping incredibly fast, but Elias flatly refused to leave the job unfinished. He stepped down into the dark water, the freezing mud immediately swallowing his heavy leather boots all the way up to his calves. He gripped the heavy steel crowbar tightly in both hands. He jammed the heavy wedge tip deep into the thick, freezing sludge surrounding the base of the massive wooden stump, blindly searching for the main taproot. The mud was incredibly dense, sticky, and highly resistant. He pulled back aggressively on the iron bar, using his powerful legs and his heavy shoulders to generate maximum physical leverage. The thick mud made a sickening, loud, suctioning sound as it reluctantly gave way. He adjusted his footing and struck again. He drove the 36-inch crowbar straight down with absolutely all the remaining strength in his 71-year-old body. He fully expected the steel tip to bite deep into the soft, spongy decay of waterlogged wood. He expected the dull, heavy thud of wet earth and rotting timber. But that is not what happened. The iron tip violently pierced the mud, sliced completely through a thick layer of ancient rotted canvas, and struck something completely unyielding. It was not stone. The powerful impact sent a sharp, agonizing vibration traveling directly up the long steel shaft, violently rattling the bones in Elias's forearms. A distinct, hollow, metallic clang violently echoed out from beneath the freezing, murky water.
Elias froze. The freezing water of Lake Cumberland lapped gently against his heavy leather boots, but he completely ceased all movement, allowing the sharp, vibrating echo of the steel striking metal to slowly fade into the frigid evening air. He pulled the heavy crowbar out of the muck. He plunged his bare, heavily calloused hands directly into the freezing black mud, plunging them deeper and deeper until the icy sludge reached halfway up his forearms. His thick fingers blindly searched the dark, submerged cavity, pushing past slimy aquatic weeds, jagged limestone rocks, and decades of accumulated rot. His fingertips brushed against cold, unyielding iron. It was perfectly flat, heavily textured with thick layers of aquatic rust, and completely encrusted with hardened, freezing clay. Elias dug fiercely, his breath pluming in the freezing 20-degree air as he tore away massive chunks of the lake bed, slowly exposing the distinct, unmistakable shape of a massive iron lockbox. The trunk was roughly 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and impossibly heavy. It was pinned tightly beneath the colossal, petrified chestnut stump, held securely in place by a cage of thick, woven roots that had grown completely around the iron over the passing decades. Elias did not rush. He systematically used the heavy steel crowbar to pry the thick roots away, snapping the waterlogged wood with calculated, immense bursts of physical strength. He wrestled the heavy iron box free from the clinging mud, wrapping his massive hands around the rusted handles on either side, and pulled backward with absolutely everything he had left. The box weighed well over 150 pounds. The muscles in his broad back screamed in sheer agony as he hoisted the dark, dripping mass out of the freezing water, dragging it heavily onto the remaining solid planks of the chestnut dock. It landed with a massive, wet thud. The omniscient eye of history knew exactly what Elias had just dragged from the dark depths of the Kentucky lake. This heavy iron chest had not seen the light of day since the brutal winter of 1932. It had belonged to a deeply corrupt, incredibly wealthy banker from Louisville, a man who had leveraged his vast financial influence to build a massive, highly illegal bootlegging empire during the absolute height of Prohibition. Fleeing from armed federal agents in the dead of night, the desperate banker had hastily buried his untraceable fortune deep beneath the floorboards of an isolated boathouse in Pulaski County. He intended to return for it. He never did. Just 3 days later, the corrupt banker took 3 fatal bullets to the chest in a dimly lit, bloody alleyway in Chicago, taking the secret location of his vast, hidden wealth entirely to his grave. The boathouse changed hands, slowly rotted away, and was eventually abandoned and forgotten by time itself, leaving the iron vault sleeping silently beneath the freezing mud for over 9 long decades. Now it belonged to a man who had paid exactly $9 for the privilege of finding it. Elias knelt beside the massive trunk, freezing water dripping from his soaked canvas jacket, and stared intently at the heavy, rusted padlock securing the iron latch. He did not tremble. He did not jump up and down in a frantic, undignified display of manic excitement. He calmly picked up the 36-inch steel crowbar, wedged the flat tip directly behind the heavy locking mechanism, and brought his heavy leather work boot down on the steel handle with a brutal, bone-jarring force. The ancient iron lock shattered instantly. The brittle metal snapped with a sharp, deafening crack, sending flakes of dark rust flying into the freezing air. Elias set the crowbar aside. He gripped the heavy, frozen lid with both hands and slowly pushed it backward. The hinges screamed in loud, piercing protest before finally giving way, allowing the heavy iron lid to completely fall open onto the wooden deck. The smell hit him first. It was an incredibly distinct, heavy scent of stale, trapped air, dry paper, and heavily oiled canvas. The interior of the chest was completely dry, perfectly sealed against the relentless moisture of the lake by a thick, hand-poured layer of industrial lead lining the iron walls. Tightly packed inside the vault, wrapped carefully in layers of heavy, waterproof wax cloth, were dozens of neatly bound, incredibly thick rectangular packages. Elias reached in and lifted the first heavy bundle. He carefully peeled back the brittle wax paper with his muddy thumbs, revealing a thick, immaculate stack of currency. But these were not the green modern bills Sterling Vance aggressively hoarded in his leather briefcases. These were crisp, oversized paper notes featuring intricate golden yellow seals and large, bold lettering declaring them as gold certificates printed in the year 1928. Each individual note carried a face value of $100. There were dozens of these bundles, stacked perfectly side by side, completely untouched by time, rot, or human hands. He set the paper aside. Beneath the meticulously stacked paper currency lay row upon row of heavy, tightly rolled canvas coin bags. Elias untied the thick hemp string of one small sack and poured the contents directly into his calloused, mud-stained palm. Heavy, massive silver coins cascaded out, shining with a dull, brilliant luster in the fading evening light. They were Morgan silver dollars, minted in the late 1800s, completely uncirculated and absolutely flawless. The sheer weight of the precious metal in his hands was staggering. Elias sat completely still on the freezing dock. The bitter winter wind whipped violently around him, but he felt absolutely no cold. He looked at the massive fortune sitting inside the rusted iron chest, and then he looked down at his own bleeding, heavily scarred hands. The universe had violently taken everything he had painstakingly built over 35 years, leaving him with exactly $34.50, only to hand him the lost, forgotten empire of a dead man in the absolute depths of his lowest valley. He did not smile. He did not shout his victory to the empty lake. He carefully rewrapped the gold notes, securely closed the heavy iron lid, and dragged the massive trunk across the rough wooden planks, hiding it safely within the cab of his rusted 1998 Ford truck. He locked the heavy steel doors, walked back to his small driftwood fire, and poured himself a cup of bitter, black coffee, watching the dark waves of the lake crash endlessly against the shoreline. Elias stared silently into the flames, completely unaware that the face value of the ancient paper meant absolutely nothing, because the true, staggering worth of his discovery would only be revealed by a trembling expert at the break of dawn.
Elias did not own a cellular telephone. He drove the rusted 1998 Ford truck exactly 4 miles down the icy county highway to a brightly lit, dilapidated Sinclair gas station. He fed quarters. He called a number he had memorized decades ago from his time sourcing antique lumber for wealthy estate owners. It was the private line of Arthur Pendleton, a highly respected historical appraiser and numismatist based in Louisville. Elias spoke for less than 2 minutes, giving absolutely no unnecessary details, only describing the date and the specific golden seal on the paper currency. Arthur Pendleton arrived exactly 5 hours later. The appraiser drove a sleek black sedan down the heavily rutted dirt road, his polished leather shoes sinking immediately into the freezing mud as he stepped out into the biting 20-degree Fahrenheit air. Arthur was a nervous, slender man in his late 50s. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, clutching a small leather briefcase tightly to his chest as he approached the rusted truck where Elias sat waiting by the smoking driftwood fire. Elias led him to the truck cab. Arthur opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick magnifying loupe and a pair of spotless white cotton gloves. He carefully lifted the heavy iron lid of the rusted chest. He reached inside, his breath catching visibly in his throat as his gloved fingers brushed against the thick, pristine stacks of 1928 gold certificates. He pulled one single note into the pale winter sunlight, adjusting his thick glasses, and stared at the intricate engraving with absolute, unblinking reverence. His hands began to tremble. "My God," Arthur whispered breathlessly. The appraiser spent 2 agonizing hours meticulously cataloging the contents of the heavy iron trunk, measuring the precise dimensions of the paper edges, and closely examining the strike marks on the heavy silver coins. He found absolutely no moisture damage, no mold, and no degradation of the precious ink. The Morgan silver dollars bore the incredibly rare Carson City mint mark, completely untouched by human circulation. Arthur finally removed his cotton gloves. He looked up at the massive, stoic man standing quietly in the freezing mud, wearing a torn canvas jacket and muddy denim jeans. Arthur swallowed hard, his voice shaking violently as he tried to articulate the sheer magnitude of the historical treasure sitting in the rusted truck bed. "These notes are virtually extinct," said Arthur carefully. "To find a single note in this pristine, uncirculated condition is a career-defining event for an appraiser.
To find an entire iron vault full of them, alongside these specific uncirculated silver dollars, is completely unprecedented in modern American history. Elias remained perfectly silent. If we carefully transport this collection to Sotheby's auction house in New York and present it to the right private historical collectors, the absolute minimum hammer price, after all taxes and auction fees, will be $2.4 million. $2.4 million. Elias did not gasp. He did not drop to his knees in the freezing mud, nor did he cry tears of overwhelming joy. He simply looked out over the gray, choppy waters of Lake Cumberland, his calloused hands resting calmly at his sides. The universe had taken his lumber empire, but the raw earth had paid him back in pure gold. "Thank you for your time, Arthur," Elias said calmly. "We will make the arrangements." The old man turned back to his ruined boathouse, ready to continue laying the heavy chestnut floorboards, treating a multi-million-dollar fortune as nothing more than a simple change in the weather. He possessed the profound peace of a man who knew his own worth before the money ever existed. But a secret of this staggering magnitude cannot be contained in a small town in Kentucky. The banker in Louisville had to be notified, armored transport had to be secured, and the local county clerk had to register the massive sudden change in legal assets. Whispers quickly spread through the sterile hallways of the Pulaski County Courthouse, bleeding out into the local diners and law offices with the speed of a raging forest fire. It was only a matter of hours. The whispered rumors of an old, discarded man finding a $2.4 million treasure chest in a rotting boathouse inevitably drifted across the county line and landed directly in the greedy, furious lap of the one man Elias never wanted to see again.
The heavy tires of a brand new $90,000 luxury sport utility vehicle tore aggressively through the frozen mud of the hidden county road. The polished black paint gleamed unnaturally against the desolate, frozen landscape, an obnoxious symbol of stolen wealth intruding upon a sanctuary of silent labor. Sterling Vance sat firmly behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his neck strained against his expensive silk collar. Beside him sat a slick corporate attorney, dressed in a charcoal wool suit, clutching a leather briefcase filled with hastily drafted injunctions and hollow legal threats. Sterling slammed on the brakes. The heavy vehicle skidded to a violent halt. Sterling kicked his door open and stepped out into the biting 25-degree Fahrenheit wind, his polished Italian leather loafers immediately sinking 3 inches deep into the freezing, foul-smelling black sludge. He ignored the mud ruining his shoes, his furious eyes locked directly onto the silhouette of the old man sitting calmly on the edge of the newly repaired chestnut dock. Elias was completely unbothered. The 71-year-old man sat on a heavy wooden crate, wearing his faded canvas jacket and holding a small, razor-sharp steel carving chisel. He was patiently stripping away the rough bark from a piece of ancient chestnut, his massive hands moving with the smooth, rhythmic precision of a man who possessed all the time in the world. He did not look up when the heavy car door slammed shut. He did not flinch when the angry footsteps marched down the steep dirt embankment. "You incredibly deceitful old fool," Sterling spat coldly, his voice echoing sharply across the freezing surface of the empty lake. Elias simply turned the wooden peg in his hand, shaving off a paper-thin strip of amber wood that curled beautifully in the freezing air, falling gently onto the wooden planks beneath his heavy boots. "Did you really think you could hide a discovery of this magnitude from the very family that built you?" Sterling demanded, stepping onto the wooden dock with an arrogant, entitled sneer masking his absolute greed. "We know exactly what you pulled out of the mud, Elias. You used embezzled corporate funds, money that legally belongs to Thorne & Son Lumber, to purchase this pathetic plot of land as a front to launder your stolen cash. That vault and every single gold note inside it is corporate property." The lawyer stepped forward. My client is completely prepared to seize the assets through a protracted legal freeze. However, Sterling is generously willing to settle this quietly. You sign 50% of the appraised $2.4 million, and we will allow you to keep this rotting pile of garbage without pressing criminal charges for corporate theft. It was a masterful, disgusting bluff. Elias stopped carving. He slowly wiped the steel blade of his chisel on the leg of his worn denim jeans, placed the tool securely in his pocket, and finally looked up into the desperate, greedy eyes of the nephew he had raised from a child. He saw absolutely no family in those eyes, only a hollow, pathetic hunger for unearned paper. "You have precisely 2 minutes to get off my wood," Elias said calmly. Sterling let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Before he could utter another poisonous word, the heavy, roaring sound of a massive diesel engine shattered the quiet tension of the Eastern Cove. A large, heavily armored white utility truck bearing the official golden seal of the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department rolled aggressively down the dirt embankment, parking horizontally to completely block the luxury sport utility vehicle from leaving. 2 doors opened simultaneously. Out stepped Sheriff Miller, a massive man in his late 50s wearing a heavy brown winter uniform, a gold star pinned proudly to his chest, and a thick leather duty belt. From the passenger side emerged Tobias Finch, carrying his heavy steel crowbar casually over his shoulder, his weathered face set in a grim, violently protective scowl. "Good morning, Elias," Sheriff Miller called out warmly, completely ignoring the 2 men in expensive suits. "Morning, Sheriff," Elias replied quietly. The sheriff finally turned his attention to Sterling Vance. His demeanor instantly shifted from warm, neighborly respect to cold, hard, professional authority. He rested his heavy hands on his utility belt, staring down the arrogant younger man with absolute, undisguised contempt. "Sterling Vance," Sheriff Miller said firmly. "I received a call from Arthur Pendleton's legal team in Louisville this morning. They figured a scavenger like you would catch wind of the appraisal and come down here trying to bully a man out of his rightful property. They sent me down to ensure the peace is strictly kept." "This is a civil corporate dispute, Sheriff," the slick lawyer interrupted quickly. "This man used our corporate funds to—" "Shut your mouth," the sheriff snapped coldly. The lawyer froze in absolute silence. "I personally stood in the back of the auction room when Elias Thorne purchased Lot 42. He paid exactly $9. He paid for it entirely in crumpled paper bills and loose pocket change. There was no corporate check, no wire transfer, and no embezzled funds. It was an open, public county auction, and he holds the absolute, unassailable legal deed to this property." Sterling's face went completely pale. "According to the property laws of the great state of Kentucky," the sheriff declared loudly, taking a heavy step closer to the trembling nephew, "any abandoned, unaired physical property, currency, or historical artifact found buried directly on legally owned private land belongs solely, absolutely, and unequivocally to the current deed holder. You have absolutely no legal standing, no corporate claim, and no family rights to a single silver dollar sitting inside that iron vault." The trap was utterly shattered. "Now," Sheriff said softly, his hand resting casually near his heavy brass handcuffs, "Elias asked you to step off his wood. You are currently committing criminal trespassing on private property. If you and your shiny lawyer do not return to your vehicle and drive off this property in the next 10 seconds, I will personally drag you through the freezing mud, throw you in the back of my cruiser, and lock you in a holding cell until Monday morning." Tobias slapped the heavy steel crowbar into his palm. The dull, metallic smack echoed like a gunshot. Sterling Vance looked at the towering sheriff, the fiercely loyal fisherman, and finally at the stoic, immovable mountain of a man sitting calmly on the wooden crate. The false bravado, the arrogant superiority, and the hollow corporate power completely drained from Sterling's face, leaving only the pathetic reality of a defeated coward. He did not say another word. He turned around, his expensive Italian loafers slipping and sliding humiliatingly in the freezing, foul-smelling mud, and practically ran back to his luxury vehicle. He was completely broken.
The lawyer scurried closely behind him, terrified of the massive fisherman gripping the heavy steel bar. They climbed into the expensive car, slammed the heavy doors, and threw the vehicle into reverse. The tires spun wildly in the wet dirt, throwing thick black slush into the freezing air before finally catching traction and speeding away in absolute, undeniable disgrace. Elias did not smile. He did not cheer, nor did he boast about his victory over the man who had stolen 35 years of his life. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his steel carving chisel, and returned his attention to the piece of ancient chestnut wood. He shaved another perfect strip of timber, letting the bitter winter wind carry away the toxic residue of his past. The fading red taillights disappeared behind the thick pine trees, marking the absolute death of a painful history, making way for an astonishing legacy that absolutely no one in the county could have ever predicted.
The Sotheby's auction concluded in the final weeks of early spring. The massive sum of $2.4 million officially settled into a highly secure trust, completely immune to the greedy, desperate hands of the outside world. An ordinary man might have instantly purchased a sprawling luxury mansion in a crowded city or a fleet of obnoxiously loud sports cars. Elias Thorne did absolutely none of those things. He knew exactly who he was. He simply allocated a minuscule fraction of the staggering fortune to finally complete the rotting boathouse. The ancient, indestructible chestnut skeleton was beautifully enclosed with thick, weather-treated cedar planks and permanently topped with a heavy, matte black steel roof. Inside, a massive cast-iron wood stove radiated a constant, profound heat, keeping the biting winds of the lake forever at bay. It was a perfect, silent sanctuary. The vast majority of the newly acquired wealth went directly back into the raw earth. Elias purchased over 200 acres of the heavily wooded, abandoned shoreline surrounding the eastern cove. He did not build a private gated estate to selfishly isolate himself from the rest of the world. Instead, he hired dozens of local carpenters, stonemasons, and plumbers, men whose hands were heavily calloused and whose boots were permanently stained with working mud. Together, they built Thornhaven. It was not a cold, sterile medical facility. It was a sprawling, magnificent timber lodge specifically designed to harbor the forgotten souls of the county. The massive structure featured a fully staffed, state-of-the-art medical wing, dozens of private rooms with heavy oak beds, and a colossal stone fireplace roaring in the center of the main hall. Elias built it entirely for the elderly, who had been ruthlessly discarded by their own blood, the weary men and women left to freeze in rusted vehicles when society coldly deemed them completely useless. He gave them a permanent fire. The local town watched in absolute awe as the charitable foundation took physical shape. Sterling Vance had successfully stolen a profitable lumber mill, but he had entirely lost his public reputation, facing endless local boycotts that slowly bled his stolen corporate empire completely dry. Meanwhile, the man he had ruthlessly thrown out into the snow had become a quiet, untouchable legend. Elias never sought out television cameras or newspaper interviews. He simply woke up every single morning, put on his worn leather boots, and continued working with his bare hands. Spring eventually broke the bitter grip of the long winter, bringing a gentle breeze that pushed the ambient temperature up to a very comfortable 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The morning sun slowly crested over the distant dark green pine tree line, casting brilliant, piercing rays of golden light directly across the perfectly still surface of Lake Cumberland. The heavy, comforting scent of fresh pine needles and brewing dark roast coffee completely filled the crisp dawn air. Elias sat quietly on the edge of the immaculate, newly rebuilt chestnut dock. Beside him sat Tobias Finch, his rough hands wrapped tightly around a steaming tin cup. The old fisherman did not speak for a long time, simply watching the gentle golden ripples on the open water, entirely at peace with the quiet, unbreakable brotherhood they had forged in the freezing mud. "It is a truly beautiful morning, Elias," Tobias muttered quietly, his voice carrying deep, unspoken respect. "It certainly is, my friend," Elias replied smoothly, his pale blue eyes reflecting the bright, unyielding sunrise. The wood was finally solid. In this unforgiving world, the broken things that arrogant men eagerly throw away into the freezing dark are sometimes the exact, perfect foundation required to build an absolute miracle.